He's Howard Ibach, former copywriter and creative director, and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Well, Henry, we've got a great guest today. It's the first time we've had one person come back for the third time. His name is Cameron Day. If you followed our show, you know who he is. He'll tell us more. Let's join the conversation. Henry, we're back with another episode, and we are graced with the first guest who is here for the third time. Cameron Day is here to shill his book, Stones and Sticks, which is part 3 of his The Advertising Survival Guide Stage 3. We've had him on for the first 2 books, which were the first one was Chew with Your Mind Open. The second was Spittin Chiclets. So now he has completed his trilogy, and I think there's so much wisdom and important information for wherever you are on your career trajectory. So these are must reads, and I'm happy to say, Cameron Day, welcome back to the Brief Brothers. Henry and I are delighted to have you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. And I'll add real quick that number one, congratulations, because you completed what you set out to do, which is to write 3 books addressing the 3 kind of stages of a advertising creative's career. And you did it in a very entertaining way, but also I think a really educational way. I think all the anecdotes that you provide are real world. And I think this fills a gap that there's a lot of advertising books out there about ways to think and but not ways to succeed in the industry. And I think that these 3 books together will outlast all 3 of us, because the advice, I think, is very good. And I also very much appreciate the inscription here with it. You embossed this. It says, "This belongs to," and you wrote my initials there, HG. It says, "Boosting is bad karma." So nobody steal my book.
Yeah,
buying is much better than boosting.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that we need to remind our viewers and readers is that each of these books, it has a foreword written by a legend, right? Lee Clow wrote the foreword to the first book. Thomas Kemeny wrote the second, and my former boss and friend Rob Schwartz, who I'm trying to get on our show, he keeps slipping through my fingers. We'll get him one day. Wrote the foreword to your 3rd book. So you've got some heavyweights. And then, you know what? I just was looking at this again. Our friend George Tannenbaum, who was also a guest way back when, I think you could hardly ask for a better blurb and endorsement of the book than these words: "Ever wonder who mentors the mentors?" Well said, George.
Throwback to VW. Ever wonder how the snowplow driver gets to the snowplow?
Yeah.
Without going under the snowplow? Because I've been under one.
Right. So I think Henry and I can both say, I can speak for Henry when I say we are honored to call you our friend. So thank you for joining us.
You guys.
So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in all 3 books, but let's focus on this new one. And I want to start out by asking you, it's a fun little story that you outlined in the opening of the book and how you titled, it's Stones and Sticks is a nice little twist on a cliche. And I smiled as I read how you arrived at this and describing the stick people. But I want you to tell the story of how you came up with this title.
How I came up with the title?
Yeah.
It's not as good a story as you think.
Well, that's what I read in your foreword.
I thought of Sticks and Stones, and I thought, oh, that's clever. I like Sticks and Stones. And plus, there's a gum motif that I've carried through the 3 covers. The first one, Chew With Your Mind Open, looks like a piece of bubble gum in the shape of a brain.
Yeah,
so
that's
the
true.
second one, Spittin Chiclets, shows what I considered a little bit more of an elevated type of gum, something you might pass out in a meeting, right? So I got to the third one, I go, I got to do gum again, or I wanted to do gum again. So I thought, well, what would work for a stick of gum? So I started with, if I know I'm gonna have a stick of gum, where can I go from there? And I thought of sticks and stones. I thought of sticks as representative of people putting sticks in your back, and stones is what you have to get through this business with any semblance of integrity. And I know that's a little off color. I hope I don't get canceled for that stones thing.
Not
But the
by
funny
us.
thing was, my
Not
wife
by
said to me,
us.
well, I'm glad you like your title, but don't you think there's probably a lot of books with the title Sticks and Stones? So I went to Amazon, I put in Sticks and Stones, and sure enough, 3 dozen books are called Sticks and Stones. So I went back to the drawing board, and then I was talking to my graphic designer, Andrew, who's actually staying with us today. I might have him poke his head in and say hi. And I was trying to figure out a way around it. And then it occurred to me, what if I just flipped it, Stones and Sticks? And I actually thought, well, that's a more interesting title.
Yeah.
At least I came to that point of view, but I actually think it's more interesting inverted like that. And I think I spent a lot of time trying to think laterally, and it was kind of a lateral way of solving.
That's a classic thing that a copywriter or a creative person does, is you look at a problem and then you just turn it around and see it from a different 180-degree difference. And that's the nice solution.
So yeah, sticks, knowing I was using a gum motif, and I'm done with my gum. I'm putting my gum motif behind me.
You're gonna stick it under the desk.
Yeah.
And I really like the analogy of sticks and stones, because I think that's one of those things my dad really drummed into my brain quite early. This idea that you're paid to have an opinion, even if people disagree with it, you have to stand your ground at some point. You have to have some you have to be willing to take chances, and you have to be willing to lose.
It's kind of the foundation.
Whether it's a job or an idea. I mean, I've been through so many rodeos that I've realized all I have is an opinion, right? But I try to be right more than I'm wrong.
So
and I try to stick by what I believe in.
One of the themes that I saw in, and I admitted, I don't know if I did it before we started recording. I admitted that I've jumped around in this book and I haven't read it cover to cover, but I have read big chunks of it. But one of the themes, and you just talked about having an opinion and sticking to it, but there's also an undercurrent of realism. In your narrative of like, there's a time to stand up, and then there's a time, when you're going to be faced with situations that aren't optimal, like, when you were hired to be a change agent, but then the agency loses a major account, and suddenly standing up for, provocative creative isn't the agency's MO anymore, but that's what you were hired to do. And you have to be realistic and understand what's happening. That doesn't mean you have to accept it forever. In another place in the book, you say, always be looking for your next job, because we all know that, it's one of the things that I give in my canned speech to students. It's the last pontification of 10 that I give them. You're going to be fired. You're going to find yourself without a job. You're going to get laid off. You're going to get fired. And it could be your fault, not your fault, doesn't matter. So you have to make peace with that and kind of be prepared for it. Yeah. So the realism, again, in the book, to me, it's not just pie in the sky, like, just stick to your guns no matter. No, sometimes you got, you're very realistic about the political games that are played at agencies, the personality types you're likely to encounter at agencies, that are not necessarily for the good. I love that you give nicknames to unsavory people who you don't want to mention them by name, for obvious reasons, but you give them funny nicknames, and then the people that you admire, you call them out by name, which was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. There was one anecdote about someone you fired and you named them by name, and I wanted to get your thinking on that. I think he was belittling an agency partner.
It's not his name.
Oh, okay.
It's a fictitious name. I may not have spelled out, we'll call him, but that's a fictitious name.
Okay, I didn't know
my,
that.
My point is, I'm not doing this to embarrass people. Everybody has embarrassing days in advertising. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody has things they wish they could take back. At least I hope most of them feel that way in the final analysis. I've had people call me up and say, between you and me, who is this? And I go, if I wanted you to know, I would have told you. It's really not the point. The point is
that's a good point.
you're going to come up against those types of people. And when you do, I'm hoping you're taking away the larger point. They're out there. Be aware, watch your back, be careful. It's still not going to help you avoid getting shanked every time, but if you just be aware, I think is all I'm saying.
So I want to stay on the topic of letting people go, firing and laying people off, and then I'll let Howard chime in. Since we're on the subject and I already kind of introduced it, it was one of the chapters that, looking in the table of contents, I was immediately attracted to. And the reason is because we've long here on the podcast since the very beginning talked about the lack of preparedness, and that's why your books are great. The lack of preparedness that most creative directors have when they assume the role of creative director, because the first few years of your career are very inward focused. They're like, I want to get better at being a copywriter. I want to get better at being an art director. And it's about me becoming a craftsman at a high level. And then suddenly you have this D at the end of your title, which means director, which means now you're a manager, but you didn't take any management courses. They didn't train you in management, and none of that shit happened.
Yeah.
And now you have to manage people. And part of that is motivating them, firing them, reprimanding them, firing them. And that's not something people think about very often when they're junior copywriters. Like, someday I'm going to have to sit in an office and tell somebody that it's their last day and they got to pack their shit and go.
Yeah.
So I want to applaud you for addressing that. And it's something that I think is important. And, it's always an uncomfortable moment letting somebody go. And you also talk about layoffs and, being aware, as long as the account isn't too huge, sometimes layoffs, I think, can have a beneficial effect for an agency, because some of the dead wood normally most agencies, when they're smart and they lose an account and they say, we need to lose 10 FTEs, let's say, they don't fire the 10 FTEs that were directly affected by the account loss.
Right.
They fire the 10 lowest on the totem pole in terms of skill, ability, whatever they're contributing, and say, we'll reshuffle the people that were on the account that are good,
right?
Because it's worth preserving them. So I think that's also a realistic strategy. But of course, you also talk about when you lose a mammoth account, there's going to be hundreds of dozens, if not hundreds of layoffs.
Well, and I guess as I look back at my career, I think the worst things that have ever happened to me were almost always followed by good things happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have to be open to the universe maybe laying some pretty heavy hints in front of you. I've been at agencies where I did some of the best work of my career, but didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about how do I fit in here, but how do I make the work stand out? Mm-hmm. And I think oftentimes when you fall on hard times, agency priorities shift, and all of a sudden you're the outlier for doing exactly what they asked you to do when you started.
Yeah.
That's just part of the drill. And I guess it's never been my MO to go, well, I can change and be just like everybody else. I go, well, now that you put it that way, I understand. I don't like it. I don't agree with it, but I understand.
The other thing, and I think it's good that you mention it in the book, is even though it's a little bit common sense, but sometimes common sense isn't so common, which is when you lay off somebody, do the hard work of giving them references, introduce them to people, try to help them out. Because if it's truly a layoff situation, that they lost their job through no fault of their own. And I think the corollary to that is, I try never to badmouth anybody in the industry, even if I had really bad relationship with them,
Yeah.
because you never know who that person's best friend is. And you could be sitting at an interview and they're like, oh, what did you think of so and so? Oh, that guy's a jerk. And he's like, oh, that's my brother-in-law or whatever. And you're like, oh shit, you know.
Yep.
So I think it's just, number one, it's common sense, and number two, good karma.
Well, it's a lot like signing an NDA. When you sign an NDA, it actually means something. You're not supposed to talk about other people's business to people who have no business hearing it. And I think in a very real way, when it comes down to firing somebody, that's a conversation that happens between nobody in the agents but me and that employee. And it's a very personal thing. And I think if you just shut your door and face it head on, and have your rationale. I've never had anybody give me a hug for firing them, but I've actually had somebody come up to me a year and a half after I did it, thinking he probably hates me, and say, hey, I want you to know something. I understand why what happened, and you were right, and thank you for doing it, because it pointed me in a different direction. And I've been pointed in a different direction against my wishes before myself. And I find if you don't let it eat you alive, and you just go, okay, I was an outlier. They no longer needed an outlier. Go find somebody who needs an outlier.
I totally, that resonates completely with me. I was at one job where for about 2 weeks, there was a Mexican standoff between I quit and you're fired.
Yeah.
And fortunately for me, you're fired won, because I was able to collect a month's worth of severance, while I had already lined up my next job, and I was able to go to Europe and take a pre-planned vacation. And so I do think you're right. I think, and that's another thing that I end my lecture with after I say, you know, you're going to get fired. It's like, usually the ending is a happy one. I've been able to fall up almost every single time in my career. Because of what you said. You just have to keep your ears open and keep your antenna up for possibilities, and listen to what the universe is telling you. And I think, don't be a martyr continuing to work at a place that has a miserable environment or something like that. I think ultimately that's selling your soul more than agreeing to do work that's less than stellar. I think worse is to work in a poisonous environment.
Yeah, no, I think a toxic environment, even if you're getting good work out of it, is not good for you. And
absolutely.
And short. And I've talked to so many people who've gone to work at great agencies, and I go, hey, is it true? I heard about the hours there, and they're like, oh man, it's terrible. We're having check-ins at 3 a.m. And I've never had a check-in at 3 a.m., nor would I get on a check-in at 3 a.m.
Yeah. I remember taking a job in Chicago. It was the first time I'd ever moved from one city to another, very, very early. It was like third or fourth job in my career. And I was very reluctant to take the job. I loved the idea of moving to Chicago from Milwaukee, my hometown. The job was at an agency that specialized in pharmaceuticals. And they were looking, this is in the early 90s, and they were looking to bring in, I guess you'd call me a branding specialist. I hadn't really focused yet on what I called my specialty, which was direct marketing and direct response at this point. I was a more classic branding or branded copywriter, and they wanted to start doing this direct to consumer. This was at the earliest stages of direct to consumer, where they were going to, we weren't doing TV spots, but we were doing a lot of idea driven creative, as opposed to it's safe and efficacious, which is what every pharmaceutical ad was doing. So that was an example, and I was just a copywriter. I wasn't even a senior copywriter. I was just a copywriter. But they wanted me to push ideas rather than the explaining the biology. And that was a tough environment, because I got pushback every time I turned a corner. No, we've got to say, we can't say that. We can't say that. We can't say that. The FDA is not going to let us say that. And so it's like, well, my charge is to do this, and you're not letting me do it. What, and my boss was really good. He's a political animal, but it was a real challenge. And the reason I bring this up is because this was, like I said, the third or fourth job. You know, my dad was a physician who worked at a hospital for his entire career, 35 years, one place.
Wow.
So my first job as a copywriter lasted 6 months.
Yep.
I got laid off, and I was devastated. My father was
Worried.
I mean, he didn't know how to deal with this. It's like, you're
Yeah.
fired? A man who's never been fired in his life, now you're fired. And you know, I was there for 6 months, and then I got my next job fairly quickly, and I realized, oh, I know why it's so hard to. It was really hard to get that first job.
Mhm.
But once I got the first job, and then I had to get my second, it's like, oh, everybody just bounces from one shop to the next. Even in a little community like Milwaukee, we just bounce from one shop. Whether it was a tiny shop or one of the bigger shops, we didn't necessarily follow accounts. Sometimes we did, but it was just, once you got into the network and you knew a few people, you just get on the phone and call. I lost track of the number of times I got laid off after about 6 or 7 times, because it was just, but for me, it was always, I take it to the next better job. I went from junior copywriter to copywriter to senior copywriter to copy supervisor to creative director. And I couldn't, if I hadn't been laid off, because it's a great way to gauge your book. You don't know how good your book is until you have to show it to somebody and who says, oh, wow, this is really good.
Well, and I think the other value in fighting the good fight and not compromising the work to save your job might allow you to get the level of work in your book that you're going to need to get the next job. So
yeah,
I think that's that I've gone stretches when I didn't get any produced work, and it became very concerning to me.
Mm.
I've sat down and done spec ads for my book before, but I think the best thing you can do is just keep pressing for the work to be as good as it can possibly be. I'm not saying you're going to sell dancing chicken to just any client, but I do find oftentimes that if you have a smart solution, it's a lot harder to kill a smart solution than it is to kill a super wacky one or a completely irreverent one or a I've never seen this before. I mean, I oftentimes find that you can look at other categories, like when I worked on WoW, internet and cable. What made them amazing is their CEO had built this amazing culture, but their work looked completely boilerplate.
Mm.
And I sat with her and I said, you want to do to refresh your brand, but can I just make the observation that after spending time around you and being around your call centers and meeting your employees, your work doesn't reflect who you are, and who you are is so much better than any cable or internet company I've ever heard of. Well, she said, well, what might the work look like? And I went back to the agency and I thought to myself, within her category, what if I made her Southwest Airlines? And when I went to them, I said, I'm not going to look in the eye and tell you this hasn't been done. But because I based this on the same kind of thinking that led to the Southwest Airlines campaign, but within your category, it'll be differentiating, and it'll definitely be about you, your culture, and your people.
I'm glad you mentioned that WoW anecdote, because I did read about it. And it ties back to something Howard was just talking about, which was, he said, well, they hired me to do this job, right? And then they made it hard for me to do the job.
Right.
And that was exactly what your experience was on WoW at that B2B agency, was they hired you. So I think the lesson is, when they recruit you to be a change agent because they've identified that they need to change, be a little bit wary that they possibly is not within them to change.
Well, the other thing that happened in that particular job is I interviewed with the president, I interviewed with the highest ranking account person, and I interviewed with the planner. And it started with the president, and I really liked him. No sooner than I took that job, the other two pushed the president out. And they were all old friends. I was like, oh boy, this doesn't look good to me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I think it's worth clarifying that the client loved the work and you did the work, but the agency principals who hired you to be a change agent, you made a change for the positive. And I think the anecdote you say is, if you make the work 50% better, someone's 100% likely to hate you more. Like,
yeah,
right.
well, I mean, you also
I'm sorry.
No,
You
go
make
ahead,
it
Cam.
work 15% better, 15% better,
Yeah.
you're a genius. You make it 50% better and everybody will hate you. That was,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'm thinking back in my career, my first non-agency job when I made the leap to the client side, near the end of my career, I got a call from a recruiter. This is when I was in Minneapolis, and this was for a retail company that sold collectible coins. And it was a lot of direct response. So there's long copy, and you get to do some juicy storytelling, which was to me very appealing. But the recruiter said, there's just one little piece of information that you need to know, and that is there've been, and I don't remember the exact number, but he said something like there have been 7 creative directors in the last 10 years.
Mm.
The CEO is hard to work for.
Yeah.
And I said, okay. So I went, I said, I mean, I had nothing to lose, and I didn't need the job. It was intriguing. So I went in and I started with the HR person, and I met the staff, and then I climbed the ladder to the different people. And I kept asking the same question. Why should I work for this guy? What's the point? Why would I want to subject myself to this kind of abuse? I said, well, it's a good company. We make a lot of money and blah, 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 blah. And so I finally got to the point where I passed muster with everybody, and they said, we'd like you to meet the CEO. And so I sat down and meet the CEO, and it was one of those moments where you just sat there and listened, because he owned the hour. If I got in a minute of conversation, it was fortunate. And I finally did get my moment. And I said, everyone here has told me that you are really hard. I thought, I'm going to just go for broke here. I have nothing to lose. I said, everybody here says you are really difficult to work for. Why on earth would I take a job like that? And he did this. He sat back in his chair. Like, what the fuck? He didn't say what the fuck, but he's like, you're saying that to me? And he leaned and he said, oh, the problem is with me. It's with this person. It's with that person. It's with this person. And that told me a lot. That told me a lot right there. I said, okay, well, he's a difficult personality. And I accepted the job, and I learned how to work with him, because no matter what I did, I wrote long copy, I wrote great headlines. He rewrote everything because he could.
Micromanagers.
Because he could. So I learned how to deal with that, and we got along spectacularly. And this is a long-winded way of saying to you, Cam, because I know you've heard this before, the other books. I wish I had these books 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Because, I managed to figure out how to deal with that pharmaceutical agency. I was blessed by it because we lost business and we had a massive layoff. And so I got out without having to quit, which means I got severance. I figured out how to deal with this really difficult personality. I've figured things out, maybe not as well. What you have done here is fill in a huge void. There's nothing like this out there that I know of. And it's so important. And I want to use this as a transition, because I jumped to the back of your book as I was looking at the table of contents. And you can see I've highlighted, if you can see I've highlighted just three lines that I think deserve to be carved in stone on Madison Avenue or in Cannes or somewhere, because they're brilliant.
Oh.
And
I hope I didn't steal them.
Well, even if you did, amateurs plagiarize, professionals steal. That's my mantra. I'm going to just share one or two of these with you. It says, you can stop carping about the way things used to be and be part of the way things are going to be.
Relevant.
I'm really sick. I'm really sick and tired of hearing this moaning and groaning and bitching about how things were better back in, when, nothing is better than right here, right now.
Yeah.
Nothing is better. And it's about, and you said that advertising, somewhere else you said that, here it is. It's not a question. I didn't underline this one, but I remembered it. It's not a question of whether advertising is going to change. Advertising is change. Yeah. One of my earliest creative directors, from whom I've learned the most, and I've quoted him on our show. He's the guy, Tom Jordan. He's the guy who said, draw the circle, but don't complete it.
Oh, yeah.
He said advertising is, in many, many ways, advertising is like folk art.
Yeah.
But we're in the tip of the spear of pop culture.
Yeah.
So it can never be stagnant.
No. So if you are going to look back and carp on what's gone because it's better then than it is now, you find another profession. Go become an accountant.
Yeah, right. Go work in a toll booth.
Yeah, exactly. And let me just read a couple other lines that I think are just stellar because it addresses AI here. And, everyone's talking about AI, and Henry and I have talked about it. He said, simply stated, ideas that don't already exist cannot be artificially copied. Mic drop.
Yeah.
I've said versions of this, but this to me sums it up so well. AI is going to be a great assistant, but it still needs that human element to say, yeah, no. Without it, and the problem that I think we all face as advertising practitioners, as people who admire and advocate for good work, is there are going to be way too many people out there who simply say, yeah, it's fine. I don't need to add to it. Just let it do the work for me so I can move
Yeah,
on to other things.
Well, I think it's very easy to become lazy and complacent as a creative
Yeah.
person. I know so many creatives that they can have so many good skills, but if they think the world owes them a living, watch out.
Yep.
Because it just doesn't.
I had my first job in LA. When I moved to LA, my first job was at a retail agency that had a lot of major brands. And the creative director said, when I would push back, he'd say, listen, I got a mortgage. That was his answer. I got a mortgage. It's like, so I'm not going to push. It's like, okay. I learned a lot from creative directors about what not to do and how not to lead, more than from the really good ones. And this last line of the three that I highlighted here.
That
Cam,
sounds like a prototypical client. I always say,
yeah.
the typical agency creative has the career ambition of winning a lion at Cannes, and the typical client has the ambition of sending his kids to college.
Well, this was a creative director who probably should have been on the client side.
Yeah.
But this is the last line that I underlined that I thought this is just brilliant. He says, inherently understanding what it means to be human is your most effective weapon. And this is where AI will never replace us, because you're asking, when you go to AI and you expect it to do more than it can do, you're asking a Boolean logical device to think like a human being. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. You either confirm it or you improve it, but it will not replace you. It simply can't.
I think a good example is the one that Cam gave about WoW and how he came up with an idea to be the Southwest Airlines within the cable internet space. The AI is not going to come up with that. However, you could ask once you came up with that idea, you could ask the AI, what companies have succeeded by focusing on their employees and their superior customer service and their marketing. And you might have gotten beyond Southwest Airlines, you might have gotten a couple of other examples that you could have drawn from to add to what you were doing or thinking. But the original idea came from you. I mean, you read the pattern of, this is a pattern that exists within this industry that also exists in this other industry. And this is the most successful brand in that industry and how they handled it. I think that's pretty genius. And I don't know that any AI is going to come up with that.
I'll tell you a couple stories that led me to the aha of Southwest Airlines, right? This is the cable company where I called and I talked to the people in the call center. And one of the things I noticed, the first thing they'd say if somebody called up and you heard them say, "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Would you mind telling me why you've chosen to
leave us?"
Leave us? When the answer was, well, times are tight and I've got this bath towel set that I've been wanting to get. And I was sitting down looking at my finances and I realized if I just went with that cable for a month or two, I could go get the bath towel set. The person who took that call said, "Can you hang on a second?" Put it on hold, calls the CEO, who was told, if you ever get a call from somebody who doesn't have a good reason for leaving, direct the call straight to me. The CEO picks up the phone and says, "I understand. My name is Colleen Abdullah, and I understand you're going to cancel your service because you have some bath towels that you need to get. Would it be possible for me to come see you?" And the lady said, "Well, yeah, fine." So she goes, "Great." She writes down the address. The next day she goes to Bed Bath & Beyond. She gets a $300 gift certificate. She drives over to the woman's house. She goes, "I can't afford to lose customers who are good customers. I want you to take this and go get your towels, and know that if you ever hit a bump and you can't pay your bill, call and talk to me about it."
Yeah,
And
that's customer service. That's customer service. Yeah,
Right.
Amazon treats me that way.
Yeah.
I placed an order just the other day and I realized I ordered something that was redundant to something else that I'd ordered. So I wanted to send it back. So I don't need this.
Yep.
It was a food item, so they don't accept returns of food items, even though I didn't even open the package. I don't mean the thing. I meant the package arrived from the UPS guy and I didn't even open that.
You
And
know,
I called and I said, I don't need this. I made a mistake. And they said, well, we can't accept it back. Would you accept a refund?
oh,
I said,
I'm sorry, did you say
you can,
refund?
you can keep it. You can keep it and we'll
Right.
give you a refund. I said,
Right.
that's extraordinary. I don't, I'm happy to send it back to you. No, we can't take it back because it's food. So we'll give you a refund. It's like, okay, you
Well,
won me. It's good customer service.
I think one of the things I try to always do is I don't walk towards an account thinking, what can I do for my book using this account as, it's like the answer is always within the business, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I went to her and said, look, I'm not saying this is the wildest idea ever created, but if you looked at Southwest Airlines as a prototype, this is how your website might look, and this is how your direct mail would look, and this is how everything would feel, and it was always driven by your employees, using actual employees and retelling stories that they had file folders full of these stories that I'm telling you about. So it was so easy for me to say, this is not because I want to do a Southwest Airlines lift as a campaign. This is because it's the right thing for you to do within your industry to make a difference with your brand.
I think there's a, go ahead, Kim.
And that's where you get the clients who realize, oh, this isn't about him. This is about me. He's really thinking about me and my business. That's when you gain that trust, where all of a sudden things become so much easier because they realize you're looking at them. You're not, I'm not trying to sell them a Little Caesars spot with a cheese pull that goes half a mile.
I think there's an important takeaway there, which is the work that doesn't seem sexy at first, when you get to the heart of a communication problem and solve it, the story makes it sexy. Like I could hear about this, cable and TV company. I read one chapter, I could read another, like about how that whole thing went down and why so I think sometimes, I think creatives, younger creatives, less mature creatives, might fall to the temptation of like what's flashy and loud and in your face and breakthrough, as opposed to me, a campaign that really works is very sexy. Like one of the things, the campaigns that I love, I don't just love them because they're outlandish or whatever. Like to me, the stuff the Richards group on who is it? Is it who is it?
You mean Southwest Airlines?
No, Geico. It's
Martin.
The
Martin Agency. The Martin
Martin
Agency.
Martin Agency.
The stuff they do for Geico, and particularly early on when they were changing the fortunes of Geico, and Geico was changing its model to a telemarketing based model. The work was great. The cavemen, they brought back the cavemen, which put a smile on my face the other day. I saw a spot with a caveman. But the BMW, ultimate driving machine from the 70s, not just the work, but the story behind the work. That's why we're big fans of that. It doesn't exist anymore, but what was the name of the podcast? Cleo.
Yes.
Tagline.
Yeah. The
Tagline.
story, how they got to the idea and the challenges that you have. The most interesting man in the world is another one. Like, to me, ultimately that makes it sexy. But and another chapter that I read was about awards, which awards I think are a hotly debated topic in our industry, and for senior creatives, it's kind of like the notches on their belt, right? The awards they win, but no jury has the time to sit there and understand the story that went out, like how hard it was to
Right.
sell this goddamn thing in, and why it makes perfect sense for this brand in this situation. They only like really have the attention span to see whatever the hot flashy thing was. But I'm of two minds on awards. I mean, obviously everybody wants to be appreciated by their peers. It's a currency that we deal in that, you know, says you can perform at a high level. And also, I think if you're an agency that wins awards, it makes it appealing to job prospects that
Yes,
say,
it's a recruiting tool.
I want to see myself there. I want to. So I think there is some good with awards. Obviously, there are agencies that take it too far. And the amount of like fake work and, you know, just doing pro bono stuff just to do something, you know, coming up with an idea and then shopping it around. All of that stuff to me smacks of, it's not really rewarding what we should be rewarding, which is stuff that sells.
You know what occurs to me? I wish we lived in a world where creative said, I'm going to sit down and come up with a spec campaign to put in my portfolio and admit that it's spec. That's not about winning awards. That's showing how you problem solve.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why that isn't what
I've done that plenty of times, you know,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I mean, I've done exactly what Henry's talking about. The first award I ever won was for an agency in Milwaukee. The creative director, this very creative director that I could like to quote, who said, "Don't draw the struggle, don't complete it." He said, "Oh, we need to win an award in this category, so come up with an ad for that category." And so I was among many creatives who sat down and wrote, came up with ideas, and I finally came up with an idea that hadn't been done before. I'm looking at the Clio. I didn't win the actual statue. I won the, what do you call it? The runner up or whatever.
Yep.
For the best use of sound in radio. And instead of having actual sound effects, the guy who did the reading read the sound effects.
Okay.
So it was just kind of clever. One guy would say something because it was a spot for a dehumidifier. So he said, summer in Wisconsin. And the other guy said, sound effects, ploppy sucking sound of moisture on the floor. Right. You get out of the, and that's all he did. And so we won an award because he said, we haven't won, there's nobody won an award in that category. We're going to do it. And it was all pro bono. Right. Okay, that's fun. But, to your point before, Cam, it's about, can you keep that little machine well honed? And so if you're between jobs, you sit down and you write ads, you write ad-like things to put in your book.
I'll tell you what, when I have found, Howard, that when I reread my first book, I can rewrite it in my head and go, man, I could have done so much better on that paragraph. It's a muscle and you're exercising it. And because I sit down every day and I write stuff, whether it's freelance, whether it's advertising, whether it's blogging, it's just write, read, documentaries, watch Netflix and study it for narrative and how good dialogue is, right?
Yep. Yeah. And I did a TikTok post about advice from Tennessee Williams. Gore Vidal was hanging out with his buddy Tennessee Williams, and Tennessee was noodling on something at his desk, and Gore asked him what it was all about. He said, "Oh, I'm just trying. I didn't like the ending for A Streetcar Named Desire, so I'm trying to fix it." This was 10 years after it had been on Broadway and had won, I don't know how many awards. And he was sitting there noodling, trying to write a better ending to Streetcar Named Desire. And it tells you that great creatives are never done. They're always looking at a way to make things better.
Yeah. And I think that whole thing we were talking about making sure you're problem solving where people are using media. It's no longer about, can you write a good print ad? Oh my God, I haven't been asked to write a print ad in years.
I know. Well, let me ask you this, Cam, and we know your background. You had a dad in the industry who gave you a lot of advice. You were the son of the founder, one of the founders of Chiat Day. What do you think your dad would say if your dad could be with you right now? What do you think he'd say about these 3 books that you've written?
Can't believe it. You wrote these? I can't believe it. Because I've never walked around life saying I've got a book in me. But it was when my dad passed when I thought, he was so damn modest and he took so little credit where he rightfully could have taken a lot of credit. And it was out of a desire to at least attach some of those accomplishments I've had to the person who made it possible through the great advice he gave me. And one of the things I find so interesting about him is he knew I didn't want to go to work at Chiat Day out of pure pride. But he also didn't program me to behave like a Chiat Day creative. He said, be the guy who shows up early, puts on a pot of coffee, gets 90 minutes worth of thinking done before anybody shows up, and leave on time and go home to your wife. And if anybody asks you why you're leaving at 5 or 6, tell them you put on the coffee. It works.
I
Yeah.
want, as we're running down on, I want to close with 2 anecdotes
Sure.
from the book that I think are good bookend to what you were just talking about. One was, do I have to work with the old guy? And you went to your dad and you said, why do I got to work with the old guy? You had just had like a breakthrough with your creative partner.
Right.
And because of that success, they said, well, we want to pair you with the old guy because you got stuff to learn from him. And you were like kind of demotivated by that. And your dad basically read you the riot act and said, you know what, you'd be passing up a gigantic opportunity. It turned out to be a guy who mentored you. And I think the lesson is, if you're young, don't be afraid to be mentored by the old guy. And when you're the old guy, don't be afraid to mentor the young generation.
Absolutely. And the thing I find so interesting about mentorship, and the word is so overused, I try not to even say the M word anymore. But it does work both ways. When you sit down with somebody who is online every day using all these apps that you've never touched before, if you just look at what apps they're using and ask them why, you're learning about how they consume media, right? And then you in turn can give them tips about, oh, well, if you're going to use a voice of any kind, what if you use this kind of voice? Or what if you add a sound effect in there? And it works both ways. And I think with mentorship, it often gets turned around to where mentees think they're not mentors either, but they are if it's done right.
Yeah.
At least that's how I feel. I go and talk to classes and I get just as charged up as the kids do.
And the other anecdote I think is appropriate is like, that one was about your dad. The other one is about your son, Cam, too, and how you started him, inadvertently down the road, and he ended up writing something that you sold to a client.
Yes.
And then you had to confess to the agency that, oh, it was my son actually, and then you got him an internship there.
Well, I didn't get him an internship. The principal of the agency, God bless him, was amazed by the story I told him. Basically, I said, look, I've been letting my kid work on assignments with me because he's threatening to want to go into advertising. I don't know if it's real, but instead of going to ad school, I go, how about giving him real briefs so at least he's problem solving on things that aren't softballs, right? Mm-hmm. He ends up coming up with this idea, and it's really a genuinely good idea. And I said, okay, I'm going to present it to the boss guy as if I came up with it, because I can't admit to him that I've asked you to work on it. But if he buys it, I'll figure out a way to tell him. When he heard the idea, it was for a pitch. He goes, I love that so much, I want to shoot it spec. And I thought,
now you got a problem on your hands.
Now you... So, and he was nothing but gracious about it, because he really felt as if he was getting 2 writers for the price of 1. I was working on it independently. My kid came up with this idea. I told him, go do 12 examples of that idea. And one of those examples, after the original idea, the principal of the agency just absolutely loved it. And it ended up being shot by Robert Rodriguez's go-to DP, a guy named Shane Kelly. So it was nice. It was one of those miracles. You never hear of a spec.
That's a nice thing to start your book with, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that he started his book with is a coffee table book about the building of a high-rise building, where I was asked to work with him on an idea that I came up with, called it 39 Stories for 39 Stories. And it required interviewing different people involved in the build, interior designers, reading about Italian marbles, reading about motorized windows that you could program with your phone to open, so you had the view the minute you walked into your space.
That kind of goes back to the theme that we were talking about before. Is like, if you look at anything deep enough, there's
Yeah,
going to be
right.
a compelling story there.
Yeah.
You know, you're
Yeah.
talking about a building, but if you could find interesting angles, that's
Well, I'll tell
something
you
you.
what,
The
this building,
Capodastro bar is replete in a building. I mean, there's so many things going on behind the surface.
well,
Absolutely.
particularly a high-rise, residential high-rise
Hmm.
in Austin, to where they weren't messing around. Every floor you went, it added 500 grand to the price. I mean, you got up to the top. It was unbelievable. And they were building the building as they were selling it. So the penthouse wasn't done. They were halfway sold out already. What they would do is they would fly a drone up to that floor and turn around to show you a 360-degree view to where the person who bought the penthouse would understand what the view was before the building
Wow.
was erected. It was just
Wow.
so fascinating.
Well, one of the things that I did enjoy, and I enjoyed many aspects of this book and all three of the books, was your chapter on how a book becomes the new calling card, the new business card. And I discovered that myself when I wrote books on the Creative Brief. And the books I wrote on the Creative Brief launched an entirely new career for me.
Yeah.
So what have been some of the unexpected benefits for you of these three books?
Well, I will occasionally get people reach out to me and go, man, I bet your book's doing really good. You must be making a bundle. Well, nobody makes a bundle writing books. So my first advice I always give them is, if you want to write a book because you want to write a book. Don't write a book to monetize, right?
Right.
It may monetize, but that's a bad reason. I really wanted to honor my dad and honor all this fantastic advice that he gave me throughout my career, because none of the people I worked with, their parents didn't understand what they did. And my dad knew exactly what it was about. Can you imagine having that advantage and having a little red phone that you could pick up anytime and go, your son is really fucked up. What do I do now? Without anybody watching. And it was like having a hotline to the right answer, usually the right answer. What an advantage.
Absolutely. Not a lot of people have that. I mean, I have a wife that works in the industry, but we're like, we're kind of at the same age, same level. So we help each other out, but it's not like coming from that point of experience, especially someone as noteworthy and accomplished as your dad. So congratulations on a fantastic book.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys, and always a pleasure being on your show. And
One more question, Cam.
Sure,
What's
please.
next? What's next? Do you have any other books that you want to tackle? Is you're done with just the trilogy, or is there a fourth book?
No, the trilogy is a trilogy.
Okay, fair enough. Makes sense.
I don't want to reveal too much, but I've got a fourth book that's already coming together.
Okay, well,
Well, in the same way that I'm gonna give a little love to your book, the book you wrote about adoption.
Oh, thank you.
Already Home?
Already Home, yes.
I am not adopted. I picked it up going, well, I hope this is halfway interesting to me. It pulled me in. And I realized it's because the same part of me that if I don't understand a subject and I have the opportunity to learn, that's the kind of reading I most like doing. And I learned so much about the adoption mindset from reading your book. Great book, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's great. Well,
So,
we have a love fest going on here. So, let's just kind of glow and bask in that. Cam, you are the author of 3 amazing, extraordinary, insightful books on the advertising career that all creatives really must read. It's the Advertising Survival Guide. Stage 1, Chew with Your Mind Open. Stage 2, Spittin Chiclets, and the brand new book that just come out, Stones and Sticks. Once again. You know, you're our first three-peat on the Brief Brothers. So thanks for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers.
I'm
We are
looking
really
for it when
grateful
the
to see
fourth
you.
one's ready.
Okay. We will absolutely have you back on. Definitely.
Hey, thanks so much, guys. Great stuff.
Oh, good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
He's Howard Ibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye bye.